Welcome to Argyle Stories Episode 1. This is a series about our football club, but it's not a series about tactics. We're not doing deep dives on formations, pressing triggers, or whether the left back should tuck in when the 8 goes wide. If that's your thing, I respect it, but that's not what we're doing here. This is a series about something else. It's about vibes. It's about community. It's about what was going on in Plymouth at the time, and it's about the people who shaped Argyle, owners, managers, players, not just by what they won or lost, but by the legacy they left behind in the city and in the fanbase. Because if you support Plymouth Argyle, you already know this. This club isn't just a team you follow, it's a place you belong to. It's part of how you measure your life. You remember where you were for certain goals the way other people remember weddings. You can track whole chapters of your childhood by who the manager was and which stand you sat or stood in. You can walk through Plymouth and attach memories to street corners because of what you were talking about after a match. And that's the spirit of this series. We're going to tell the story of Argyle through eras, through ownership eras. These will be the periods I grew up with and lived through as a fan, from Dan McCauley through to Simon Hallett. But we're not just going to talk about what happened. We're going to talk about how it felt. What did Plymouth feel like in that moment? What was the mood of the city? What did home parks sound like, feel like, and even smell like? What did you hear walking up through Central Park? What did a big night under the floodlights do to people? Because football is never only football. In Plymouth especially, it's tied up with identity, with pride, with being the club at the end of the map, with being overlooked and enjoying it, but also resenting it a bit, with long away trips and stubborn loyalty, with the Green Army doing what it does, turning up anyway. And I want to be clear about something from the start. This series will cover big controversies, because Argyle, like any real club, has had its storms. But we're not here to throw mud or make reckless claims about individuals. We'll talk about what was said publicly, what was reported at the time, what fans remember, and how fans felt. And we'll always remember that football stories are complex because real people are complex. The aim here isn't to prosecute the past, it's to understand it, to understand why Argyle supporters are the way we are, why certain names still carry weight, why certain moments still sting, and why, every now and then, Home Park can still produce a night so magical it makes the whole city feel alive. One more thing, this isn't just my voice telling you what I think. A big part of this series is personal memory, because Argyle isn't something you watch from a distance, it's something you live. So I'll be bringing in what I remember, as a kid, as a teenager, as a fan, the radio commentary nights, the matchday rituals, the moments where you fall in love with the club, and the moments where it breaks your heart. And hopefully, as you listen, you'll bring your own memories too. Because that's what Argyle does. It gives you stories. So that's Argyle Stories, a series about a club, a city, and the feeling of belonging to something that refuses to die. Right then. Let's start where a lot of modern Argyle memory begins. A night under the floodlights in 1996, when Wembley stopped being a fantasy and became a plan. Let's go. The night we believed again. Let me start with a confession. Supporting Plymouth Argyle in the 1990s wasn't a hobby, it was an emotional apprenticeship. You didn't just watch football, you learned patience, you learned gallows humour, you learned how to feel hope, and hold it like a hot mug of tea you don't fully trust not to spill. And every now and then, Home Park would do this thing. It would produce a night so electric, so ridiculous, so full of magic that it recharged your loyalty for years. May 1996, playoff semi-final, second leg, Colchester at Home Park. Now I wasn't there. I was 11. It was a school night. So my version of this match isn't a ticket stub or a terrace photo. My version is lying in bed with the radio on, listening to Radio Devon, heart absolutely hammering. And here's the funny thing. In my mind, it has to be Gordon Sparks on commentary. It feels like a Sparksy kind of night, but I can't swear it was him. Memory does that with football. It edits the story into the most cinematic version. But whoever it was on the mic, you could tell from the first minute. Home Park wasn't just loud, it was alive, because Argyle had a problem. We'd lost the first leg 1-0, so it wasn't one of those nice, comfortable evenings where you can ease your way into belief. It was one of those nights where the whole stadium turns up with the same message. We are not leaving this to chance. We're dragging this club to Wembley if it kills us, and I want you to picture home park under the floodlights, that classic look, the dark edges, the bright pitch, the stands pressed tight with people. You can almost feel the air crackling. And the crowd. You know when you can hear a crowd through a radio? That's when you know it's special, because the crowd isn't just background noise, it's part of the match. Then bang, 3 minutes in, Mickey Evans, trigger, and suddenly it's one of those moments where the whole ground goes up like someone set off fireworks inside your chest. In my bedroom, I'm not shouting. I'm doing that weird silent celebration you do as a kid when you don't want your parents to come in and say, "Richard, it's late." So I'm celebrating quietly. But my heart is sprinting. And you could hear it in the commentary. You could hear the crowd thinking, "We've got them. We can do this." Then just before halftime, another moment. Free kick. Chris Ledbetter, and it's one of those goals that doesn't just go in the net, it goes into the soul of the crowd. Now it's 2-0 on the night, and you can feel the shift. You can feel Home Park transforming from nervous to ferocious. At this point, as a fan, you start doing the most dangerous thing in football. You start planning, you start thinking about Wembley, you start thinking about who you'd go with, how you'd get there, what you'd tell your mates at school. And then the second half happens, and this is where the match becomes legend, because Adrian Littlejohn breaks through, bearing down on goal, and he gets brought down. It's the kind of moment where everyone in the ground knows what it is. A red card, surely. The ref gives yellow. You can hear the roar through the radio, the outrage. And on the touchline, Neil Warnock absolutely loses it, because Warnock isn't a manager who does calm acceptance. Warnock does moral fury. Warnock does, "This is an injustice and I will now become a headline." He goes mad. He gets sent off. And this is the detail that makes him a Home Park legend almost 30 years later. He doesn't just go down the tunnel like a normal manager. He hops over and goes into the Mayflower stand. He stands with the fans. That is one of those football moments that bonds a manager to a fan base for life. Because it's not tactics. It's not a substitution. It's identity. It's the message. It's us against the world, and I'm with you. If you've ever wondered why Warnock is still spoken about like a cult hero at Home Park, it's nights like this. He wasn't managing the crowd, he was joining it. Then of course Argyle do the Argyle thing, Colchester score, Mark Kinsella, it's 2-1, and suddenly the whole story wobbles. At points over the two legs it felt like Mark Kinsella was single-handedly carrying Colchester, like he was there to stop our party. And the 2 goals he scored over 2 legs were goals of beauty. And as a kid listening on the radio, this is the bit where the fear arrives. Because you can feel it, even without seeing it. That awful swing in football where the whole crowd goes from celebration to, "Not like this, please, not like this." And then it builds to the moment, late on. And the highlight footage makes this even clearer. Martin Barlow picks it up on the right. Now Martin Barlow is from Barnstaple, not Rio, not Sao Paulo, Barnstaple, but in that moment he's playing like he's part of the legendary Brazil 1970 side. His touch of the ball is perfect, he's gliding, he's fearless, he's absolutely on one, and he swings in this cross. A proper cross. A cross with belief in it. And at the back post, Paul Williams arrives. Willow? And he rises, the world slows down, temporarily stops spinning, and Willow heads it home. And this is the bit I remember most clearly, because it isn't just a football memory, it's a childhood memory. When Willow scores, I don't cheer quietly anymore. I run around the house like I've scored the winning goal myself, because that's what football does when you're 11. It's what football still does to me, if I'm honest. It plugs straight into your nervous system. It turns your whole body into celebration. And at Home Park, it's pandemonium. At the final whistle, people are on the pitch. People are hugging strangers. People are crying. And there's another image from the footage that I remember vividly. Up in the grandstand, Dan McCauley is there, jubilant, wearing a novelty Pilgrim Pete hat, arms raised, and it's a perfect little snapshot of what football can be on its best nights, because for one evening, everything is aligned. The fans, the manager, the chairman, the players, the city. Argyle is heading to Wembley, Plymouth is heading to Wembley. And after that night, the city buzz was unreal. I remember it vividly. It felt like more people were going to Wembley than staying in Plymouth. Everywhere you went, it was the same energy. We're going. We're actually going. And Home Park does this. Every now and then it creates an evening match that feels magical. But here's the reason I'm starting the story here, because this magic night happened inside what many fans remember as a difficult decade. A decade of instability, a decade of arguments about what Argyle even was, a decade that toughened the fan base and shaped what we demand from owners to this day. So next, we zoom out. What was happening in Plymouth in the 1990s that made nights like this feel so important? Because once you understand the city, you understand the decade. That's where we're going. A city between tides. Alright, before we even get to the chairman, we've got to talk about Plymouth. Because Argyle in the 1990s didn't exist in a vacuum. It sat inside a city that was trying to work out what it was becoming. And if you grew up anywhere near Plymouth in that decade, you'll recognise the mood. The early 90s especially were a bit drab. Not end of the world drab. More grey cardigan of a decade drab. For me, Plymouth at the start of the 90s was mainly Saturday shopping. I was living out in Ivybridge, and Plymouth was the place you got dragged into with your parents. Plymouth in the 90s felt a little worn, but it was still breathing. The city centre stretched itself out across Royal Parade, New George Street, Cornwall Street, long lines of shops, open doors, people moving with intent. This was before Drake Circus concentrated retail life into one glossy bubble. 3 decades later, those streets feel like what's left after the fire, a scattering of vape shops, phone repair kiosks, and the sense that the main act has already packed up and left. And every now and then there'd be one of those moments where everyone's suddenly a bit tense because somebody had phoned in a bomb scare. It's weird what sticks in your head as a kid, not the statistics, the feeling. But behind the feeling there was something real going on. Plymouth had always leaned heavily on defence and the dockyard. For generations, Devonport wasn't just an employer, it was identity. It was apprenticeships, routines, family pride. It was the sense that if you worked hard, there was a track you could run on. And then through the late 80s into the early 90s, that track got ripped up. Big defence cuts, thousands of jobs gone, unemployment spiking, and you felt it in the city's posture, because a place carries economic stress like a person carries stress. In how they walk, in how they speak, in how the future sounds when you say it out loud. There was this period where Plymouth's confidence was low. People were asking quietly what the city's next identity even was, if it wasn't just ships and the dockyard. And when that's the backdrop, football becomes more than football. Not because a match fixes anything. It doesn't. Football mainly gives you fresh things to worry about, but it does give you ritual. It gives you a shared language. It gives you a place where, for a couple of hours, you're not thinking about the big stuff. You're thinking about corners and referees, and why we can't just clear our lines like normal football teams. And that's why Argyle mattered so much, because in a city that felt a bit unsettled, Argyle was a constant, a slightly chaotic constant, obviously, but a constant. Then mid-decade, the cultural mood starts to shift. Britpop, Euro 96, that whole things might actually be getting better vibe. And politically, the Tories are kicked out, and New Labour arrives with that big national reset energy. Even down here, you could feel the country changing tone. And personally, that's around the time my relationship with Plymouth changes too. From 1995, my family moved into Plymouth itself, and that's when my mum took me to my first ever Argyle match. Pre-season. Chelsea. Which, by the way, is an absolutely ridiculous way to start supporting Plymouth Argyle. It's like starting your driving lessons in a Formula 1 car. But it worked, because once you've been to Home Park, properly been, it gets under your skin. And from then on, we became season ticket holders, and that ritual started. You start learning your route, you start recognising faces, you start understanding that Home Park isn't just a stadium, it's a gathering. And Matchday in Plymouth has its own texture. You've got the walk through Central Park, you've got that moment where you see the floodlights or the stands, and it just feels like, right, this is the place we do our emotions. You've got the sounds, the shouts, the same little routines, and if you grew up here, you'll know exactly what I mean when I say the smell of Matchday is basically pasties, Bovril, burgers and damp coats. And the crowd has that special Argyle mix, warm and friendly, but also permanently ready to take offence on behalf of the club. Because being Argyle, being this far down the map, does something to you. You get used to being overlooked, you get used to long away trips, you get used to people treating your club like a footnote, so you become protective. And you develop this identity that's half pride, half defiance. We're the Green Army. We're not asking for your permission. We're not waiting for anyone to notice us. We'll just keep turning up. And it's not just the match that becomes a ritual, it's everything around it. The chatter in school, the chatter at work, the conversations in town, that feeling after a big result where the city just walks a bit taller. And in the 90s, fans also start building their own public square around the club. Fanzines, fan writing, and then early internet. This is when Argyle supporters start creating spaces where they can document the club, argue about it, laugh about it, and basically do what fans have always done, just with a bit more organisation. Because when you love something and you don't feel heard, you don't go quiet. You get creative, you get louder, you start writing, you start sharing, you start building your own version of the story. And here's the point I want to land. In Plymouth, Argyle isn't just the club, it's a civic symbol, it's an identity anchor, it's a community habit, and that means something important for the story we're telling. Because when a new owner arrives, it's never just a business event. It's emotional, it's cultural. People aren't only asking, will this owner make us better? They're asking something bigger. Do they understand what this club is to us? Do they respect what this means to this city? Do they get the unwritten rules? And that question, respect, belonging, who the club is really for, sits under the entire McCauley era. So now we meet him properly. Dan McCauley arrives as the majority owner in 1991, and at first, to plenty of people, he looks like ambition. He looks like progress. He looks like the start of something. And then the decade starts doing what it does best, turning every hopeful sentence into an argument. That's next. McCauley arrives. Optimism with conditions right, so we've set the scene. A city that's a bit battered in the early 90s, a club that means far more than it should to the mental well-being of the people who follow it, and a fan base that doesn't just want wins, it wants respect, stability, and the feeling that the club is in safe hands. So into that walks Dan McCauley, local businessman, majority owner from 1991, and at the time, the basic vibe is relief. Because football clubs at this level are always one bad month away from a drama. So when someone turns up with money, the first instinct is to exhale. You can almost hear people thinking, thank God, someone stepped in, we might actually be alright. Now I'll be honest, I wasn't properly following Argyle when McCauley first arrived. I was too young, and my Argyle obsession hadn't kicked in yet, but even I knew one thing very quickly, because McCauley's early era comes with a headline decision so loud you can't ignore it. Peter Shilton. Peter Shilton at Plymouth Argyle. Just pause for a second and remember what that meant in the early 90s. Shilton isn't a former player. He's an England legend, a national name, a bloke your colleague in work definitely knows, even if your colleague doesn't know the rest of your team. So when Shilton becomes player manager, it feels like Argyle are trying to upgrade their status overnight. It's the football equivalent of turning up to a wedding in a sports car you don't fully know how to drive. And fans loved the idea. Of course they did. Because we're down here at the end of the map. We get overlooked. We don't get glamorous things. So when glamour turns up anyway, you grab it with both hands. And I want to flag something, because it's a theme that will return later in this series. Argyle has a soft spot for a headline appointment. Shilton in the early 90s has a certain energy to it that will feel familiar when we eventually get to Wayne Rooney under Simon Hallett. Not the same situation, obviously. Different time, different club, different context, but the same basic instinct. Bring in a name, shift the story, lift the mood, make the rest of the football world glance in our direction. Because sometimes a big appointment isn't just about coaching, it's about belief. Now here's where the optimism with conditions part kicks in, because Shilton arrives and the reality check arrives right behind him. Argyle still get relegated in 1992, and that's the first time the relationship starts to tense up, because relegation does something very particular to a fan base. It doesn't just disappoint you, it makes you suspicious. It makes you start asking, okay, so what exactly is the plan here? And once fans start asking that question, the club enters a different phase. The honeymoon phase ends. The scrutiny phase begins. And by 1993, you start getting those moments that become symbols. The one people still talk about is the Exeter game at Home Park. Easter Saturday, Derby Day, and Argyle get battered. And the reaction in the stands is absolutely volcanic. Fans start launching their season ticket books onto the pitch. Just imagine that for a second. That's not normal moaning. That's not a few boos at full time. That's a crowd saying, this isn't what we signed up for, and we want you to see it. It's theatre. It's protest. It's heartbreak disguised as anger. And it matters because it tells you something. The fan base is already starting to shift from hopeful to hardened. Now, while that's happening, there are also early signs that McCauley's relationship with the wider Argyle ecosystem is prickly. Because another thing starts to appear in this era: conflict with the local press. Stories of reporters being frozen out, bans from certain areas, a feeling that the club is trying to control the narrative rather than ride out the criticism. And again, I'm not mind reading anyone's motives here, but from a supporter point of view, it tends to land the same way every time. If the club starts treating journalists like enemies, fans start wondering who's next, because fans rely on the local press for oxygen. Not because every article is fair, it isn't, but because when things are going wrong, people want information. They want transparency. They want to feel like someone's asking questions on their behalf. So, even in the early years, the club starts to feel a bit braced, like it's getting into a posture. And as that posture grows, the fan culture responds in the most Argyle way possible, with humour, with fanzines, with sarcasm. This is the era where the fan voice starts becoming more organised, the sense of supporters creating their own public square. Because when you feel like the club isn't listening, you don't just sit quietly. You write, you joke, you rant, you build your own record of what's happening. So by the time the mid-90s arrives, Argyle is already carrying something, not just results, a mood, a relationship dynamic, a set of expectations. And that's the heart of the McCauley era story. It starts as rescue, it quickly becomes scrutiny, and pretty early on you can sense the fault line forming. Is this club being run like a business where the fans are customers, or is it being held like a civic symbol where the fans are stakeholders? That tension is still running through Argyle culture today. So that's part 3, the arrival. Not yet the full collapse, not yet the big controversies, but the early ingredients, the glamour move, the relegation reality check, the first flare-ups, the first signs of a relationship turning edgy. Next we go deeper into the first big symbol of McCauley's early era, the Shilton gamble, what it said about ambition, what it did to expectations, and why, in Plymouth, expectations are never a small thing. The Shilton gamble, glamour meets gravity. Okay, picture Plymouth in the early 90s, a city that's not exactly swimming in glamour, a club that's wobbling, a fan base that's loyal but also permanently braced for impact. And then one day the club basically says, right, we're going to fix this by hiring Peter Shilton. Peter Shilton, England legend, record cap holder, a man whose name belongs on a sticker in a Panini album, not on the team sheet at Hartlepool on a wet Tuesday. Even though I wasn't properly following Argyle at the time, I still knew this was massive. It was everywhere. Local news, local chatter, that slightly disbelieving tone people use when they're repeating something that sounds too big to be true. Wait, Shilton? Here? At Argyle? And that's the key thing about the Shilton appointment. It wasn't just a football decision. It was a statement. It was McCauley saying, we're not thinking small. It's that same instinct you sometimes see later in football, where a club tries to change the story by bringing in a famous name. Not because the name is a tactic, but because the name is a feeling. It's a vibe injection. And for a moment, it works. Because when Shilton arrives, everything goes up a notch. The attention, the buzz, the sense that Home Park has suddenly become interesting to people who normally couldn't point to Plymouth on a map without using both hands. And Shilton himself plays into it. He talks about the challenge, the professionalism, the standards, and you can imagine the pitch as he sells it. Look lads, I've played at the highest level, I know what it takes, follow me and we'll get out of this. But here's the thing about lower league football, it doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care how many caps you've got. It doesn't care how famous your face is. It doesn't care if your name makes your dad nod respectfully. It's like the ocean. You don't get special treatment out there. You either swim or you get dragged about. And Argyle at that moment were in a relegation fight. So yes, there's glamour, but there's also gravity. And gravity is undefeated. Now there are moments in this Shilton period that feel almost mythic in a very Plymouth way. Like the little stories fans tell about seeing him actually in goal for us and thinking, hang on, he's still got it. People talk about his reach, those saves that feel impossible, that sense that for a second you've got England's number 1 protecting your club. But the big moment, the one that turns this whole section into a gut punch, is the final day. Home Park, packed, One of those afternoons where the crowd turns up with their whole nervous system exposed, and Argyle need it. They need a result. They need survival. And for a moment, the dream toys with you. Argyle score, and suddenly you can feel it. Home park believing, that wonderful thing where a crowd starts doing the maths in its head. People aren't saying it out loud, but you can sense it. If we hold this, if we just hold this, we might actually do it. Then football does what it does. Blackburn score, then they score again, and there's a particular kind of pain that comes with that second goal, because the first goal is, oh no. The second goal is, this is happening. And if you watch the highlights now, you see one of those moments that's brutal precisely because it's human. A cross comes in. Shilton goes for it. And it doesn't work out. And look, I'm not saying this to have a go at Peter Shilton. The man's a legend, but the image lands. Because you've brought in a national hero, and on the most important day, you get a moment that reminds you, he's not a superhero. He's just a man, in a relegation scrap, at the end of a season, in a stadium full of pleading. And by full time, it's done. Relegation. The Shilton rescue mission doesn't pull it off. And this is where the Shilton gamble becomes emotionally interesting. Because you'd think relegation would kill the story. But at Argyle, it rarely works like that. At Argyle, relegation doesn't end the drama. It just changes the flavour. Because the next move is double down. Shilton stays. Money gets spent. There's a rebuild vibe. That classic football optimism where everyone convinces themselves, okay, yes, we went down, but now we'll bounce straight back up. No worries. And you can see why people bought into it. Because it's Peter Shilton. You assume he'll impose order, professionalism, a higher standard. But then the season starts, and the grind returns. And the reality bites again. Third-tier football is not impressed by your budget. Local rivals aren't impressed by your press coverage. And away days don't care about your reputation. And the era starts to take on these oddly Plymouth details, like Shilton's famous motivational line where he tries to say phoenix from the flames. And it comes out as something like pheasant from the flames. Which is brilliant because it's both funny and perfect. Because that's Argyle. Even when we're trying to be glamorous, we end up being charmingly weird. And then there's the back pass rule coming in around that time, which basically means goalkeepers have to use their feet more. And suddenly you're watching this England legend at the far end of his playing career in a lower league stadium dealing with a new rule under pressure, and fans start doing the unthinkable. They start groaning when Peter Shilton has the ball at his feet. Imagine telling someone in 1987, one day Plymouth Argyle fans will groan at Peter Shilton's kicking. They'd have you tested. And there are other awkward headlines floating around the era too. Things that made the local news, controversies around the club's lottery operation, and Shilton's name being mentioned in connection with it. I'm not here to declare guilt or innocence. That's not the point. The point is the vibe. The point is the story starts feeling messier. Not just football messy, off-field messy. And once the vibe gets messy, the relationship gets tense. Because fans can handle losing. We're Argyle fans. We were basically trained in it. What fans struggle with is feeling embarrassed or kept in the dark or sold a dream that turns out to be mostly smoke. So the Shilton gamble becomes a kind of early template for this whole McCauley era. Big, bold gestures. A sense of we're thinking bigger. Then a thud back into reality. Then tension. Then the supporters get sharper, more suspicious, more protective of what the club is meant to be. And yet, and this is important, this era isn't just a failure story, because the Shilton years also help lay foundations. They raise expectations about what Argyle could be. They create a sense that we shouldn't be satisfied with smallness. And they set up the next emotional shift. Because when Warnock arrives later and Home Park starts producing that particular kind of electricity again, it lands in a fan base that's already been through the glamour and gravity lesson. We've learned not to fall for it too easily, but we still fall for it. Because we're football fans. So that's the Shilton gamble, an England legend in Plymouth, a city trying to feel bigger than its circumstances, a club trying to jump a level by force of personality, and then reality doing what it always does. Next we go back to the fan experience again, because while these big names and boardroom choices are happening, the supporters are building something in the background. Ritual, humour, resilience, the heartbeat under the gloom. That's part 5, the heartbeat under the gloom. Alright, let's talk about the bit that never gets relegated, because owners come and go, managers come and go, players come and go, but the thing that keeps Plymouth Argyle alive through the "what on earth are we doing" years is the fan culture, not the league position, not the transfer budget, not the tactical philosophy, the rituals, the humour, the tiny joys, the weird little characters who make Home Park feel like a village hall that accidentally got promoted into professional sport. Because here's the truth. In the early to mid-90s, supporting Argyle wasn't always a glamorous hobby, it was an act of faith. And faith in Plymouth comes with a pasty in one hand and a slightly suspicious look in the other. Now my own early matchday memories start in the old grandstand. Cramped seats, honestly, cramped even for an 11-year-old, and the crowd in there felt like the full cross-section of Plymouth society, with a particularly strong showing from the elderly and from men who looked like they'd been pissed off since 1974. And every stadium has its regulars, but the grandstand had characters. There was this one bloke who looked like Onslow from Keeping Up Appearances. Same vibe, same face, same general sense that he'd rather be anywhere else. Except he was there, every single match. He'd sit in front with his wife and just grumble away. Not grumble at anyone in particular, just grumble at the concept of football. And the best part is, Home Park, back then, would sometimes have a little section at the far end of the grandstand where a few away fans were allowed to sit. Which sounds calm on paper, doesn't it? Mixed seating, football community, lovely. In reality, it was basically, let's put two groups of emotionally unstable people next to each other and see what happens. And one day, I remember there was this little old woman from Gillingham, a proper tiny lady, and she ends up picking a fight with our Onslow after he shouted something at the Gillingham players. And Onslow, who had been acting like a big dog all afternoon, suddenly backed down instantly. Like a big dog who's just been bopped on the nose with a rolled-up newspaper. He turns to his wife, genuinely wounded, and says something like, "What did I do?" Which is one of my favourite early lessons in football. You can shout at professionals all you like, but the moment a pensioner with an away scarf gives you a look, you remember your mortality. That's Argyle. And it wasn't just the stands. The whole matchday experience was homemade. Like you'd go to the game and it didn't feel like an event product. It felt like the city had opened its door and said, "Come in, mind your head." I remember going for a meal and a match in that era and being served by club captain Mick Heathcote's wife. That's how small and connected it was. It was properly a family club, the kind of place where you could later interview Mick Heathcote for your school newspaper because, why wouldn't you? He's Mick Heathcote. He's down the road. It's Plymouth. Well, he lived in Ivybridge, actually. And the matchday hospitality back then? Roast dinner. Not artisan street food. Not loaded fries. A roast dinner. As in, here you go, have your carvery. That'll set you up for the second half. And it felt a million miles away from modern matchday hospitality. But it also felt like community. Like a slightly chaotic village gathering where everyone's got an opinion. My second season, my mum gets us season tickets in the Lyndhurst family section. This is where you really got the full Home Park experience. Because the club, in a truly inspired moment of organisational genius, decided to position the family zone alongside the barn park end. If you know, you know. So you've got families, kids, people trying to have a wholesome day out, and then, if there's any bother, you'd get the Argyle thugs of that era scrambling across the family zone trying to get closer to the away supporters, just absolute scenes. Blokes in full sprint, adrenaline pumping, charging past someone's 7-year-old who's holding a packet of crisps like, "Mum, is this part of the entertainment?" The club eventually moved the family zone because even Home Park has its limits, and we ended up more central in the Lyndhurst, which was a much better idea if you wanted your childhood memories to include football rather than riot control logistics. Now let's widen out, because this is the bit I really want to celebrate. In the gloomy years, the years where the football didn't always give you much to sing about, the supporters created their own reasons to keep coming. That starts with the matchday soundscape. You can hear it now if you close your eyes. The clank of the turnstiles, ticket ripped, that little moment of stepping inside and feeling like you've entered a different world, then the vendors, "Programmes! Get your programmes!" and someone else shouting about food like it's a public service, "Pasties! Hot pasties!" And the smells. That mixture of damp coats, cigarette smoke still hanging around in the architecture, and something warm and peppery that could only be a pasty that's been kept at a temperature normally used for welding. And then the noise of the stands. The Green Army shout, that long, drawn-out roar, "Green Army!" The sort of chant that doesn't just say, "We're here." It says, "We're still here. Try and get rid of us." You had the Oggy chant as well, pure local flavour. "Oggy, Oggy, Oggy! Oi, oi, oi!" Because this isn't London. We don't do generic football chant number 3. We do pasties and cider and Plymouth Argyle, and you had the terrace humour. That specific Argyle humour that's half pride, half sarcasm, and 100% prepared to laugh at itself. In fact, in the 90s, the fans basically built a parallel club alongside the actual club. Rub of the greens, fanzine culture, cartoons, satire, proper gallows humour. If the boardroom was tense, the terraces were making jokes about it. And then, as the decade goes on, fans start building that public square online as well. PASOTI, people arguing, reminiscing, organising, moaning, laughing, inventing the club's unofficial history in real time. Because when you're far from the spotlight, you don't wait for somebody else to tell your story. You tell it yourself. And that's the heartbeat under the gloom. Even when the results weren't there, the culture was. The characters were. The ridiculous little stories you only get at Argyle were. And that's why the club survives eras like this. Because Argyle isn't only sustained by money, it's sustained by people who will sit in a cramped seat in the grandstand week after week next to a grumpy Onslow and still somehow find joy in a little old Gillingham woman winning an argument. It's sustained by families eating roast dinners before the match, by players' wives serving dinner like it's normal, by kids growing up learning that home park is where you feel things loudly and together. And it's sustained by that deeper thing that started forming in the 90s and never really left us. The sense that being Argyle is an identity. It's choosing the long way, choosing the overlooked club, choosing the end of the map, choosing the team that makes you work for your happiness. And then, every now and then, the football gives you something magical in return. Wembley 1996. For a generation of Argyle fans, myself included, this was the moment. A rite of passage. The pilgrimage. Let's be honest, the game itself, bit dull, nerve-wracking, cagey, a single goal, no fireworks. But if you were Argyle, you didn't go for the quality of the football, you went because everyone was going. And I mean everyone. That week in Plymouth, it felt like the whole city was packing up and heading for London. You'd see cars flying scarves out the windows, green and white hanging off wing mirrors, coachloads of fans setting off from outside the ground, from Ivy Bridge, from every estate and village with a soft spot for Argyle. You couldn't stop at a service station on the M5 without bumping into hundreds of Janners, all trying to grab a pasty over a copy of the Herald. We drove up with some family friends, stayed in East London with an old school friend of my mum's. My dad bought the tickets. He didn't even care about football. Bless him. Just found the cheapest seats he could. So there we were, right at the back of the old Wembley, restricted view, wooden bench, felt like sitting on a garden fence while peering over the shed. But it didn't matter, because we saw it, Ronnie Morjay, rising up like a green-clad cannonball goal. The only goal of the match. And the place went off. Of the 43,000 fans in Wembley that day, over 30,000 were Green Army, and they made it sound like 100,000. From that height, it was mostly vibes. Couldn't see much, but you could feel it. That noise, that togetherness. For a club like Argyle, not glamorous, not fashionable, not loved by the media, just being there was everything. For so many supporters, this was the reward. For the long away days. For the half-time Bovrils. For the years of moaning grandstand uncles and hopeless Tuesday night nil-nils. This was payback. This was glory. Back home, the buzz carried on for weeks. Schools, pubs, workplaces, everyone talking about that day. You'd see people you didn't even know were fans suddenly in Argyle shirts. The Green Army had come out in full force, and it felt like we'd won something more than a trophy. We'd won a memory. That's what makes clubs like Argyle special. You don't need constant success. You just need a moment like Wembley, a day that lodges in your chest and never leaves. And for me, this was the moment the club got its hooks in. Wembley 96. Ronnie's goal, the restricted view, the family, the noise, the scarf on the car window. All we had was vibes. But it was more than enough. Back to earth. Wembley's hangover. Wembley 96 was meant to be a springboard. Instead, it was a swan dive. In the months after the big day out, the cracks started to show. On the surface, Argyle had momentum, a promotion, a full stadium, a manager who just walked us up Wembley Way. But behind the scenes, chairman and manager were already at war. Dan McCauley versus Neil Warnock. A relationship that curdled almost overnight. Warnock thought he'd earned trust and a bit of backing. McCauley thought Warnock was arrogant and expensive. Publicly, he said, "Football managers are not reasonable people." Privately, things got toxic. By early 1997, it exploded. Warnock was sacked. No thank you, no fanfare. Just gone. At the next away game, fans weren't chanting for Argyle. They were chanting Neil Warnock's Green and White Army. It was defiance, heartbreak, a visible rupture between the boardroom and the fan base. And then enter Bruce Grobbelaar. Yep, that Bruce Grobbelaar. Wobbly-kneed penalty king, mustachioed Liverpool legend, signed on by Warnock just before he got the boot. A big name, a headline grabber, a gamble. The idea was, get experience, get steel, get glamour. What we got was Bruce conceding 4 goals in one half and fans whispering about whether he'd thrown the game. It became a punchline. Grobbelaar wasn't the Shilton-style saviour. He was a reminder that big names don't mean big results, especially when they're driving broken squads into muddy second division grounds. That said, seeing Brucey run down the wing, presumably because, like the rest of us, he was just bored, was somewhat refreshing. Then came the managers you half remember, Mick Jones, then Kevin Hodges. Jones picked up the mess after Warnock. There was that bonkers Battle of Saltergate game, fists, cards, chaos, but mostly it was drift. The 1997-98 season ended in relegation. We were back where we started. Wembley? What Wembley? And Kevin Hodges, a club legend as a player, a trier as a manager, but the promotion push never came. We'd turn up, hope, leave disappointed. The football was grim, the atmosphere thinner, the club sleepwalking. Supporters started calling the squad absolute cloggers, blokes who'd battle but never lift the gloom. One fan called it jobs for the boys, mates signing mates, effort without elevation. We were stuck. It's hard to describe how quickly the magic went. From 36,000 at Wembley to maybe 5,000 trudging through Home Park turnstiles, muttering about team selections and Bovril. And all the while, Dan McCauley remained in charge, increasingly distant, increasingly resented. You could feel the mood turn from frustration to fatigue. One fan summed it up best. The saddest thing is, almost 20 years on, we're still in the same poxy division. That was the fear, that this wasn't a bad patch, this was who we were now. But this is also the era when Argyle fans learned something, how to endure, how to speak up, how to stay sarcastic, even when there's nothing to laugh about. This was where the never again attitude started to calcify, because after all the false dawns we weren't asking for the moon anymore, just a club that didn't punch itself in the face. Scars, antibodies, and never again. You don't come through the McCauley years unchanged, you carry something with you, a bit of scar tissue, a few antibodies, a healthy instinct to flinch when someone says, trust me, because this wasn't just a bad run, it rewired the fans, it taught us what not to fall for, it planted seeds that would shape the very soul of Argyle for decades. Let's start with a scene burned into the brain of every long-time supporter. It's 1997, tensions already sky high. The club's in chaos, and Dan McCauley, never one to take criticism quietly, bans the local press from Home Park. No more match coverage, no more media, nothing. So what does the Herald do? They rent a cherry picker. No, really. They hire a 60-foot-high platform, hoist reporter Chris Errington into the air, and park it just outside the stadium so he can file his match report mid-air. Supporters looked up and saw this lone journalist floating above the Lyndhurst like some kind of media balloonist, trying to do his job despite a club trying to shut him out. That's how bad it got. And that's how absurd it got. Because this was a club at war with its own supporters, with the press, with the city council, with reality at times. McCauley's statement swung from the combative to the bizarre. One minute he's blaming fans for poor attendances. The next he's floating plans to build a mega stadium on Drake's Island. Yeah, Drake's Island. It's a lovely place to kayak round, less ideal for hosting League Two football. But by then, it wasn't really about football. It was about distance. It was about control. It was about a man who didn't seem to think Argyle belonged to the people of Plymouth, but to himself. And Argyle fans, the Green Army, started to learn something important. They learned not to rely on what the club told them. They learned to find their own voices through fanzines, forums, and flags held aloft in protest. They learned that if the club was going to survive, they might have to be the ones to save it. You can trace the foundations of PASOTI, of the Argyle fans' trust, of the modern-day supporter culture, right back to this mess. Because for all the pain, it created something permanent. A mindset. Don't trust easily, don't follow blindly, and when it feels wrong, shout. The fanzines of the era gave McCauley a nickname, the Fat Controller. He became a pantomime villain, skewered in cartoons, mocked in songs. One piece even compared him to Slobodan Milosevic. Yeah, that happened. It wasn't just cruelty, It was resistance. When you feel powerless, sometimes humour is your only weapon. Even the stadium tells a story. Dan McCauley underwrote the redevelopment of Home Park's 3 modern stands, what fans still call the horseshoe. For decades after, the old grandstand stood out like a sore thumb against the modern horseshoe, a monument to what he built, and to how chaotic his tenure really was. You still hear the phrases today. Never again. It started as a reaction to McCauley. It echoed again in the dark days of administration in 2011, but now it's become a rule to live by. Never again will this club be left in the hands of someone who doesn't understand it. Remember Drake's Island. A punchline now, but also a warning. When the promises get too big, when the gloss feels too shiny, someone in the fan base will always pipe up. We've heard that before. That's why stability matters to Argyle fans more than almost anything. It isn't just about the league table, it's about trust. It's about feeling like the club belongs to you again. So when an owner comes along who's a fan in the boardroom, who replies to fans' messages and emails, who fronts up when things go wrong, it means everything. Because we've seen the opposite, and we haven't forgotten. Never again. Before we go, it's worth sitting with McCauley's 2 enduring legacies because they went on to endure long after he left. First, the horseshoe, that grand green curve of Home Park, underwritten on his watch, feuds, press bans, fallouts, and yet week in and week out, it's still there, full of voices. Second, Paul Sturrock, a sharp-eyed Scot with a gift for turning chaos into momentum. McCauley appointed him as his final managerial appointment as chairman, and in doing so, he handed the club a route out of the noise and into a new era. Because from 2001, the club belonged to Paul Stapleton, a fan, a local, a different kind of leader. Next episode, we dig into the Stapleton years, what changed, what didn't, and how Luggey's Green set out to rise again. It's a hell of a story. And yes, it involves silverware.